All right, so welcome everyone. This is our third Science Up. I know it was a little weird last week. We did not have one. We had a huge reptile event and I just was afraid about getting everything set up. So we didn't have one, but instead what we did, if you were really looking forward to our water birds last week, we just pushed it back another week. So we were supposed to end on November 10th with the last one, but then we just pushed it back one more week to November 17th. So we will still have it. I won't shortchange you guys. It just will be a week later and a couple weeks later than it should have been. So today we're talking about seeds and leaves, and I think this is a perfect time because at least here in Lincoln, there's a lot of leaves. They're still just starting to drop. They're changing their full colors now, but they're getting ready to drop, and you can really see the diversity of leaves that are out there. So we will go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen with everybody. All right, there we go. All right, so this is the science of seeds and leaves today. All right, so just letting everybody know, hopefully you ask questions and you make good comments. Just make sure that they are relevant to the topic on hand and that we are nice to everybody. Otherwise, we do have that right to remove you from the program. I also want to point out that I am by no means an expert. So if you have joined these before, you know that I do a lot of research for them, but I am by no means considered a botanist or an expert in trees or leaves or seeds or anything like that. So I'm going to be honest with you. When I was in college, I about flunked botany. So it was a very hard topic for me. Gotten a lot better over the years. And it's interesting now. I did not find it interesting when I was a sophomore in college, but we're working our way better. And here we are doing a program. So I do love science. So if you ask questions in the chat, we will give you time at the end to do like a question and answer session, but please feel free to ask questions. If I cannot answer them, I will find someone that can, and I will get back to you on that. So all right, so here's a quick introduction. This one might be just a little bit longer because I have some like examples and I have there's just a lot of information about seeds and leaves, and I wanted to make sure that we covered all of it. So let's just do a quick little introduction on leaves. So I'm sure everyone has seen a leaf in their life. I'm sure if you look either outside your window or if you have a plant at your desk or your house or something, you probably can see one very close to you. So we all know what a leaf is. We've seen a leaf, but what is it actually? So the simplest version that I could find is just a flattened, usually green, depends on the season. It's an outgrowth from the stem of a vascular plant or a tree or whatever you're talking about. But it is something that it's attached and it has a purpose. So the main couple purposes of a leaf and the functions of leaves we'll talk about here in a little bit. But basically, it's that free exchange of nutrients, water, and those end products of photosynthesis. So thinking all the way back to your kind of biology or early biology years, that photosynthesis is the way for the plant to be able to gather the sunlight and the energy and turn it into carbohydrates and sugars. And that is how the plant eats. So that is basically what a leaf's purpose is. It also, when we think of a leaf and we look at a leaf, it's initiated from the growing tip of a stem called the apical bud. So along with those tissues of the stem itself, but leaves do not all look the same. When you Google search leaf, you get lots of different ideas, and there's cactus spines, there's scales of like your asparagus or your onions or a lily bulb, even pine needles. They may not be the quintessential leaf that you have in your mind, but they're all just modified leaves, and we'll talk about those. But they all formed in the same manner, and a lot of them have the same function as well. But they are very efficient at adapting and gathering that sunlight. But at the same time, they also need to conserve water. Water is a huge component when we talk about plants, and especially leaves. It's critical. It helps hold the leaf into place, into that desired position. It helps during photosynthesis and the carbon dioxide releasing, and then also helps at transporting some of those sugars back to the rest of the plant. The only problem is that it's also very unpredictable. It's also very unpredictable just because right now, at least here in Lincoln, Nebraska, we're in a drought. And a lot of people, we're not even sure if we'd see our full true colors on our leaves just because there's been such little water. So water is very critical when we talk about any type of plant. All right, so what do we see when we look at the leaf? What are we looking at? There's three major parts when we look at a leaf. The first one is the petiole. So this is that stalk-like structure that connects the blade to the leaf of the stem, but not every single plant will have this. But if you look on this photo here, you see this is where it attaches to the stem. Most plants have it. Here is an example right here for you. This is that petiole. This is where it attaches right there. There's also the base of the plant. So this is the part that attaches to the petiole, and then the blade is the main portion of your leaf right here. It's generally the largest portion and also usually the flattest portion. And then you also, depending on the environment and the climate that your leaf is in, it will depend on whether it has a very thick outer waxy layer or just kind of a smaller waxy layer. No matter where you are, leaves have somewhat of a protective coating of that wax because they need to not desiccate. So that's one of the reasons that they have that. But again, it just depends on where you're finding that leaf or that plant. And then also on the very tip of the leaf, if you would use a microscope and look at it, you will find these things that look like little mouths that open and close. The stoma or the stomatas, they are the ones that use that gas exchange, and then basically use through osmosis, they will gather water and keep that plant from drying out. So here is like a microscope blown up version of those stomas. So they look like little mouths, they open and they close. And so when the plant takes in that carbon dioxide, it will use for photosynthesis. And then basically as a waste product, it's putting out the oxygen. It's basically a waste product from that process that it doesn't need, and so it lets it go. But here's those little stomas, and there's lots of them throughout the plant. All right, so that was like a very simple, like, what is a leaf? But let's talk a little bit about that function more, like why do we have leaves? What are they used for? And then just a little bit of that morphology of the leaf too. So what is the function of a leaf? Obviously, they're cool to look at, especially now in the fall. They're very interesting. Those colors are cool. But what is that huge major role of a leaf on a plant? There's three roles, and pretty much if you domino affect them, they all affect each other. But the main one is that most plants all plants actually are autotrophs. So they make their own food. So leaves are those specialized structures that carry out photosynthesis and they produce food. So if you remember again, photosynthesis is just simply that process that uses energy from the sun and carbon dioxide and water to make glucose. And then again, it puts out that oxygen almost as a waste product. Basically, it is there to make food for the plant. But there are different structures within the plant that help with photosynthesis. You may have heard of something called mesophyll. Mesophyll makes up the inside of the leaf, and that is where actual photosynthesis occurs. There also are veins. So if you look within the leaf, you see all the little veins. There's major ones, and then they kind of veinets that come across. They hold on to the major vein, and then there's smaller ones and smaller ones and smaller ones. Those are how water basically gets through to the plant and all the things get sent to the rest of the plant. So leaves over time, they will lose water in a process called transpiration. Transpiration it's going to happen. They're going to lose some water, but they don't want to lose all their water. So the veins are what helps carry the water, that xylem and the phloem that are inside the leaves. That is how water gets transported to the rest of the leaf. And then leaves are also the site of gas exchange. So those stomas or the stomatas on the plants, they're the ones that bring in and take out the carbon dioxide and the oxygen and helps during that photosynthesis process as well. All right, so here's just a blown up version of a leaf. If you would take a leaf and you blow it up, the top part here, the cuticle, that's the top part of the leaf. And then underneath, you're looking at the bottom part of the plant as well. So right here, the xylem and the phloem, that is how the water gets transported through the rest of the plant or the tree or whatever you're looking at. And then you also have this stuff called the mesophyll. That is where the process of photosynthesis takes place. And then when you look closer, you will notice that there's the lower epidermis, the upper epidermis, very similar to a person. We have different layers of skin, leaves have different layers as well. And then you're looking at things like the stoma, so those mouths that open and close to take in carbon dioxide and release that oxygen. All right, so here is just, again, breaking down a little bit more of that leaf. When we look at it, the blade is sometimes called a lamina. This is, again, that big flat surface. They have those small branch veins and the veinlets. And then the main one that runs down the middle here, that is called the midrib. So if you ever see a leaf like that, here's a great example. It runs right down the middle of it. All right. It also divides that surface into two. And again, those little veins are the things that take water and push it through the rest of the plant. But it also depends on what type of plant we're looking at. You have stuff like angiosperms, which are your flowering ones. They have a special structure called a stipule. And basically this is just, it could look very different. It could be a spine, it could be glands, it could be scale-like structures, but they are small little, they look like buds on the sides of flowering plants. Leaves overall in general, they are big in shape, they're different in size, they have lots of different characteristics, and we will talk about those today. All right, so some of the modifications of leaves, when we look at them, you may have seen some of these before, but basically they're specialized to perform that photosynthesis. But sometimes they also have extra roles to play. There's a lot of support for the plant. Some of these, like this tendril, that's a photo here, they give support for the plant and help it climb. Sometimes they do an extra job of storing some extra food, especially in places where water is not consistent. And then also there could be some defense with that as well. So the storage leaves, these are the plants like succulents that they need a little extra an extra bunch of water, they need extra food because the environments that they live in are not consistent and they don't get all that water and they don't get extra food. So they have these really large vacuoles, which is basically in plant cells. This helps with water balance. So sometimes there's a single vacuole that can take up most of the interior of a plant, but this is again for that water balance. And then there are some that help it prevent desiccation. And then like the tendril here that you see, this exists in some plants that have really weak stems. So this is just a modified leaf that helps it give it a little extra support when it climbs. A lot of times, a lot of garden vines, you will notice the ones that climb up like the fences, you will see the little curled tendrils. Sometimes they get really curly-cued. It's kind of impressive actually, but this is what those are called. Those are those tendrils. All right, sometimes you have plants that have spines on them. So a few plants have modified structures that are almost looking like needles. These are usually defensive spines, but a lot of times they will also reduce water loss by that transpiration. Again, you cannot help water loss, but you can help the amount of water and the consistency of water that is lost. You also have some scale-like leaves. So anyone that likes asparagus out there, that looks like a scale, and this is what those are. They're scale leaves. So they're very thin structures that do not have stalks. Usually they're brownish, but not always. Onions are another good example of them too, but they store food and water for the plant. And then sometimes you get little leaf hooklets. So these are just little tiny leaflets, again, that aid in climbing. They're just a little different than tendrils. All right, so here's some other structures that you might see. The phylode, this is in some plants, that petiole, which is where it attaches to the stem. It's really flat and it takes this shape and sometimes different colors. If you know what an acacia tree is, we do not have them in Nebraska. You can find them in places like Africa. They have these. They're just certain types of structures and certain types of plants. And then you have your insectivorous or your carnivorous plants. So these sometimes have lots of different types of shapes. We have one in Nebraska called a bladderwort, which down here I have a leaf bladder. So it's literally shaped like a little bladder or a little cup. And then you have leaf pitchers that are modified pitcher-like structures. And then you also have something called an androsera, which is the lamina or the blade of a leaf. It has these tiny little sticky hairs and globs at the tip to catch their prey. So basically what will happen in Nebraska with the bladderwort, it's not going to catch things like mice and bats. It's like very tiny, almost microscopic little insects that come, they get stuck in there. And basically what happens is it's a little bladder pitcher. It gets stuck in there and then they basically either they desiccate, they dehydrate, and then they can't eat and they die. And then slowly over time, those enzymes in the plant will break down that food, and that is how the plant eats. So a little bit different structures for different types of food and different environments in which they live. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about leaf differences. So looking at the shape of leaves and the teeth of leaves and how the leaves and the leaflets are placed. I think there's a couple things in the chat. Yes, someone asked, is this going to be recorded? Thank you, friends, for helping out with that. That's very nice. Yes, it will be. It's recorded and it will be placed on our YouTube channel. Awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our leaf differences now. All right, so first thing you want to ask yourself is when you're looking at a leaf or you're trying to identify a leaf, is it evergreen or is it deciduous? Most of the time it is a definite, it's one or the other, but sometimes there's a little bit of a gray area where it could be, I don't know, you have to look at multiple features. So just a very small, like quick example, what is an evergreen tree? It's a tree that retains its leaves year round, and it's pretty much always green. Not always unless it's sick or there's a disease, but usually that's green. It has these needle-like structures. And then deciduous plants or deciduous trees, the definition that I found is that they will lose their leaves less than 12 months after they grow. That's not a great definition because there's some that will consider themselves semi-evergreen or tardidily deciduous, which basically means that it might be 14 months or 18 months. So it doesn't follow that exact 12 months after they grow, but that's kind of just the average definition. So they drop their leaves to avoid freezing. They're mostly found in cold or dry climates. Not always though. Nebraska definitely is not cold. And they're also very flexible in their strategy. So if it is not the right time, they won't drop their leaves, or if they need to drop them because they're losing their resources, they will. So trees are actually very smart when it comes to that. And then all species will evolve their timing of leaf emergence, so when they come out and when they drop, to match that local climate. So you may see the same species of tree in North Dakota and let's say Kentucky. They're the same species, but they drop or their leaves will emerge at different times just based on that local climate. And then also depends, like I said, on where these trees are found. All right. So are we talking broadleaf or needle leaf trees? So one of the most fundamental distinctions between these is looking at their leaf blades. When we talk about angiosperms, so these are going to be like your flowering plants, they're going to have net-like veins. But then when you look at gymnosperms, they're going to be like parallel veins. And it's very easily noticed when you look at those. So angiosperms, again, are those flowering plants. They have seeds enclosed within their fruit. So an apple is a great example. Gymnosperms, they don't have flowers or fruits, but they instead have naked seeds on them. And then you also have to think about, is it a monocot? Is it a dicot? There's a lot of different categories that they could be. Monocots usually have parallel veins, and then dicots have the branching veins. And I will show you a nice little table here. So when you think of an angiosperm, again, these are the flat leaves. The seeds are enclosed within the ovary. They're usually hardwood, and then they're pollinated by animals, wind, and water. Gymnosperms, think of a pine cone. They're non-flowering plants. They have that naked seed. They have needle-like leaves most of the time. They're evergreen trees. Everyone kind of calls them those evergreen type trees. And then they're usually pollinated by wind. They have pollen in the seed in that gymnosperm or that pine cone. And so there's actually male and females. And then you have the weird like ginkgo tree that is technically a gymnosperm, but it's kind of within its own category as well. All right, so what do I mean by monocot and dicot? So monocots, like I said, they have those parallel leaves. The flower parts are in threes. They have a very fibrous root, but then you have your dicots. So they have the leaf veins that have almost like a network instead of the parallel lines. Their flower parts are in fours or fives, and they have usually a long tap root, not a fibrous root. All right, leaf size. So clearly leaf sizes are very different. Here's a leaf that I just picked up in the parking lot, versus like this leaf, very different sizes, very different shapes from each other. So the size of leaf, if you're trying to identify something, it's extremely variable and it's not usually the most helpful for identification. So if you look at the average size leaf on a tree, that's going to be your best bet, but don't go by just what the size of the leaf is. Some leaves are very large, some leaves are very small. It tends to grow larger, or sometimes they grow faster on the understory than they do on the top. Sometimes they're slow growing, or there's unhealthy twigs that could make it not grow as fast or not be that average size, especially with oaks. For some reason, when they have full sun, they tend to be smaller and they're more lobed than those on the more shaded branches. So if you take a bunch of leaves, they all could be from the same tree, but they might be very, very different in size. So going just by size is not a good identifier for a tree. There's lots of other features that you want to look at. So another thing you could look at is the shape. This one's a little bit more easy for identification. It's also the most studied in tree identification. Like it says not the most useful, but it's a good starting point. For a beginner, it basically gives you this is a oak, this is a maple, this is this. So it's very easy just based on that, it's some type of maple, it's some type of oak. But don't look again at just one feature. You always want to look at the length of the leaf stalk. Is it lobed or unlobed? Looking at the pattern of the veins, or looking at the shape of the whole leaf, or where you're finding it. So there's a lot of different things to think about when you're trying to identify leaves. All right, so the leaf shape, it just depends. The overall shape of the leaf, is it shaded or unshaded? Is the slow growing twig, or is it a vigorously growing twig? Was there a disease? Has it been eaten up by insect? Is it the very first one of the season? All these things you have to take into account. Also the leaf stalk. This is really good and usually is pretty consistent between most species, and it helps in really identifying between two species. So looking at the leaf stalk, or that petiole part. Maples are the exception. This is weird because usually they're about as long as the leaf itself. So those are just one of those exceptions on looking at that leaf stalk. All right, so leaves have teeth. I don't know if you're aware of this, but they have teeth. Many species of leaves have this kind of tooth-like leaf margin on the very outside of it. This is a really good example of this one here in the picture. They could be single-toothed, they could be double-toothed. They have different sizes, just depends on the species of tree and what they're using them for. Usually it's consistent within a species, so you would know that it's a oak or it's a maple. But then also the prominence of the teeth. Are they very jagged or very serrated, or is it very minimal when you look at that? So all these things you have to take into account. Also the veins. This is a huge way to tell which type of tree it is. Also, the pattern is usually very consistent. So again, these are those network of veins that help carry water and nutrients to each cell, and also helps with the process of photosynthesis. They can be conspicuous as far as texture or color, or they can be very inconspicuous. It just depends on the species. So most broadleaf trees, they have what we call pinnate veins. These are what we like, the feather-like veins. They usually have one long primary one, and in that center, there's many more little parallel ones branching off of it. There is also something called a palmate vein, which is usually 3 to 7 primary veins. And I think I have I have a photo here for you too. So what do I mean by that? So the parallel venation, or the veins, they run parallel to each other. Very easy. The pinnate ones, you have this very long, kind of that midrib or that main vein, and there's little 3 to 7 little pieces coming off of it. But then you have something called a palmate. This is where it looks like a small tree branch within the leaf. So there's lots of little small veins coming in and off of it. All right, so now looking at the leaves, how do you determine, just by looking at those shape, but then also the types of leaves? So most trees have what we call simple leaves. This is basically like your oak leaf here. So as you notice, this is just one big leaf. It's very different than, say, something like this. All right, so you have a single flattened leaf blade on most of those simple leaves. Some trees do have compound, like the ash tree is a very good example of that. So compound leaves just simply mean that they're separated into distinct leaflets. So on that petiole, you have different leaflets. Most of these leaflets fall individually. As you notice with all of our ash trees that have already lost all their leaves, they lose them individually. The simple ones, they may be lobed, they could be divided, but they don't have those distinctive leaflets. They have usually just a single bud that is formed above the point of attachment to the twig. And then they could, like it says, it could be lobed, it could have those marginal teeth on them. So a good example of this, like I said, is the oak tree. Very easy to understand. It's a simple leaf. It doesn't have individual leaflets on it. All right, so also when we talk about a plant or a tree, how are the leaves arranged? So there's something called alternate leaves. So these are the leaves that grow singly from the twig without another leaf directly across from it. So here's a good example right here. So they're not across from each other. They kind of branch out individually. But then you have something called opposite leaves. They are the ones that grow literally opposite of each other on the same level. So here's a good example. And then you have something called a whorled. This is if 3 or more leaves all grow from the same level of a twig. So it almost forms like a rosette or a circle. So those are your whorled plants or your leaves. This is really helpful for leaf identification. Also, it's helpful in the winter time because even though the leaves might not be on those stems or those plants, you can see little scars on the bare twigs and you can say, okay, this is an alternate or this is an opposite one. I can definitely tell because no matter, even if you look at them, you can see those little scars on the twigs, even if it's wintertime. All right. What about leaf color? So normally when you think of a leaf in a non-fall time, they're usually green. There are very few plants that don't have green leaves. So if they're green, there's some shade of green that usually means they're a healthy plant. The average color is usually different among species, and it could also be different in the environment. Like I said, if you have the same species in Kentucky versus a different species in North Dakota, they could have just a slightly different color of green. But it also depends on how new the plant is. It also depends on the season. So if it's starting closer to fall, they might be a little bit darker of a green or a little bit more yellow green. And then older leaves sometimes in the summer are darker or they're more bluish green because they have a lot of blemishes from damage. So there's a lot of sun, there's wind, there's insects, there could be diseases. Also by late summer, the trees usually have an indication of what their fall colors are going to look like. And those fall colors are really determined by the amount of water, the health of the tree, also the environment and the climate in which the tree is living in. So one thing that's also neat is that cultivated trees will show a large range of colors versus ones that are not cultivated. But again, it just depends. There's soil, if the tree is in really bad soil or poor soil, or if it's really wet soil, that can change the color of the leaves. But again, if you see a green leaf, you know that it's mostly healthy. All right, so what about our fall colors? Why do they change color and why do they have the colors that they do? So all of these broadleaf trees, they develop some type of color. It's usually a yellow or a red before they drop. Yellow is very common. Red happens, but less plants and trees have red colors than they have yellow colors. So basically what's happening is the chlorophyll, which makes the plant green, is breaking down. So by combining a few of these pigments together, you get a lot of different colors. So it depends on the weather, it depends on the species. For instance, some trees are always going to be red. They turn red instantly. So for here, you see there's a little bit of orangey red color in here, but on this oak leaf, for instance, it's starting to turn just a little yellow, but then some leaves it's red. It just, again, it depends. But then you also have like a sweet gum that's still bright green. Like I just picked this off the plant today. All right, so really quick, I just want to talk about this transpiration process just because it is a huge portion of it for the plant and the leaf. So it's necessary because it has to emit that carbon dioxide and allows that oxygen to escape during that photosynthesis process. When we talk about water loss, that doesn't sound like a good thing, but the fact is that it is unavoidable. Plants are going to lose water. This process of transpiration is unavoidable. It's going to happen. But again, it's the amount of water that's being lost and the consistency of water that's being lost. So there was this guy, Stephen Hales. He was kind of the first person that noticed or came upon this theory or this idea of transpiration. And he found that about 99% of the water that's taken up by the roots of a plant is released into the air as water vapor. So that only leaves 1% left, not much. Basically, over time, those plants will use those stoma or the stomata to open and close for the gas exchange and also to prevent water loss. So those stomata, they're consistent of 2 guard cells that basically form a small pore on the surface, and they will open and close depending on the environmental stimuli. So if it's raining, they'll open it up and grab that water. If it's really dry, they're going to keep it closed as to prevent that water loss. In areas that plants have really, really high humidity, and let's say they have some low light conditions, or if they're in the understory or there's a lot of plants on top of them, they basically are going to not risk losing that water. They want to make sure that they keep it in there because who knows when they're going to get the amount of sunlight. But on the same plant, you might have way too much sunlight on top. Those stomas or those stomatas are going to keep closed so they don't lose excess water. For instance, desert plants, sometimes like those cacti or some of the plants that have really unavoidable amounts of precipitation or unpredictable amounts of precipitation, they go through a lot of drought periods. Basically, they nearly eliminate water loss during the day and they keep their stomata closed. And then at night, when it's a little cooler, they will open them up at certain times. Some plants have even developed an adaptation to do a different alternate photosynthetic pathway. So there's something called a CAM or CAM plant. And this is how it's just a different way for them to do photosynthesis so they don't lose water in their environment. So for instance, a lot of like succulent plants, they open their stomatas at night and they take in that carbon dioxide. And again, they close it during the day, during the hottest part to not lose that water. All right, so we spent a lot of time on leaves. There's a lot to talk about with leaves. So I want to talk a little bit about seeds and then some of the common leaves and seeds that you're going to see here in Nebraska. All right, so when we talk about a seeds or a fruit, it was referred to as a fruit because of the seed is around, is inside that structure. So these are from your angiosperms, and this is the female parts of a flower. They mostly ripen, not every single one, but most of them ripen in the spring or the summer. And then depending on the species of plant, they might not produce fruits every single year. It might be every other year or every 2 years, or it might not produce anything until the first 2 years of its life. Again, it just depends on the plant. But they do last longer than flowers, and they also will leave behind a fruiting structure. So even, like I said, even in the wintertime, if all the plants and all the leaves and all the fruits are gone, you can look at the branches and see those scars or those certain parts that have had fruits on them, and you can identify them from there. And there's a huge range of fruiting structures that we'll talk about here in a second. So those gymnosperms, when we talk about seeds or fruits here, they have a naked seed. So these are like your pine cones. So these are the females or the seed cones. The males are actually very small and they will produce pollen in the spring and then they'll fall off right away. The ones that you start seeing now, those are the female or the naked seed cones. The angiosperms, this makes up around 80% of all species on Earth. They have different parts to them. So they have the stamen, which produces the pollen grains. The pollen itself is that male reproductive material. And then the flowers contain both female and male reproductive plants. And this is how they attract those insects, especially if they're insect pollinated, because that is how the bee is going to come. It's going to grab that pollen, it's going to move to another plant and put those genetic diversity to the test, basically. And when you think of angiosperms, it's not just the fruits, but it's also grains, it's vegetables, it's flowers. There's a lot of things that people don't think of when they think of angiosperms. All right, that was all I got for fruits and seeds. So now I'm just going to walk you through just a few really common Nebraska leaves and seeds. I tried to pick ones that you would see either Western Nebraska or Eastern Nebraska. So let's just go through these really quick. All right, so one of the really cool things that we have out in Western Nebraska, plants and trees, are going to be your Ponderosa pines. So this is in the pine family. They have those really neat code bearing seeds, so they look like pine cones, and they have those needle-like or those linear leaves. So these are true leaves, they're just modified to they're just that evergreen portion of a leaf, and they're just modified to fit that environment. So the needles for these are usually in bunches of 3, or occasionally they grow in bunches of 2s and 3s. They're very long and slender. They have sharply toothed edges. These are found, like I said, in mostly Western Nebraska, but the seed cones are very narrow. And then as you get to the tip, the scales on them get thicker and they have a really sharp, rigid, almost like a prickle at the end. So these are the ones that you're going to find out in Western Nebraska. All right. Your Boxelder Maple. So looking at this, this is a native deciduous tree that you're going to find here in Nebraska. You probably get frustrated with all the seeds that fall, but they have yellow-green flowers that appear really dense clusters. And then when they lose them in the fall, they look like those little, almost like those little 2-part helicopters. So male and female flowers are actually separate. The male flowers are on those slender stalks and in loose clusters. They kind of hang down almost like a little feather duster when you look at them in the spring. And then when they turn into those seeds, this is what they look like. It's also the only native maple tree with more than one leaflet. So usually what you see a maple look like is this. It's a single simple leaf, but for this one, the Boxelder Maple, it actually has leaflets on it. The flowers also don't have petals, and then the fruit will droop into what's called a cluster. And so why is it called a boxelder? If you know the boxelder bugs, apparently they are attracted to this Boxelder Maple, and that's how they got their name. All right, another one that's pretty common is your Bitternut Hickory. These will produce almost like a fruit. They look like a little seed or a little drupe, but they're actually in the walnut family. The leaves are alternate from each other, and if you notice on these, the leaves are getting larger towards the tip, away from the petiole instead of smaller or closer. The leaves are going to be alternate. And it's kind of hard to see in the photo here, but if you look closely, they're going to have those marginal teeth on them. So they have, each leaflet has little teeth on it. The male and the female flowers will happen on the same tree, which is different than that Boxelder Maple. And then these guys have what's called a catkin. So a catkin is basically a single cluster of single-sex flowers that has these scaly bracts on it. And they look like petals, but when they fall, that is the way that they pollinate each other. So fruits in about September through October. And then, like I said, these little fruits or those drupes on them, they have like a husk on them and they're almost yellowish like, and they have scales on them as well. All right, this one, you can either love it or hate it. Very similar to like the black locust, but this is the honey locust tree. It's actually in the bean family because if you notice the pods that it forms, they look like beans when you open them up. This is a very tough and adaptable tree. And even in Nebraska, there have been trees that they basically genetically produce them to not have the seed pods and to not have the thorns on them. A lot of people don't like the thorns and they wanted trees that didn't have them on there, so they made them. But they get their name, the honey locust, because they have, when you break open those seed pods, they have like a sweet gummy substance on them. And then these guys have tiny little leaflets. So each individual leaf has leaflets on it. They are deciduous, so they fall off every year. They turn that kind of pretty bright yellow color, and then they immediately fall. The pods are legumes, so they're beans, they're in that family. They're really long, they're flattened, and then each individual pod has a ton of little seeds in it. So when they break open or animals break open, or if you step on them or whatever, those are the seeds that then will develop into something new. All right, this is my favorite. It's kind of a nerd thing here, but I love the little seed puffs that you get at the end of the year. You can step on them and it just poofs out. But this is a sycamore. These are huge leaves. Right before we got into this science of, one of our educators had this sycamore leaf that was like as big as his head, and they get ginormous. But again, thinking about that, that might be one leaf on a single tree. And you're like, wow, what is this? If you don't know the shape of it, but then you find the same tree that has another leaf on it, but it might only be this big. So looking at this tree, you're probably like, well, that's not the same tree. But again, you have to look at more features. So this is a native plant. It grows best in those deep, moist, rich soils. It has huge deciduous leaves on it. They usually have 3 to 5 lobes. So when we look at this lobe, this is a lobe, this is a lobe, and this is a lobe. So the one in the photo has 3 of them. So for this one's seed, it will produce these really spiky seed balls. They were green when they start, but then as the year goes on, they will turn brown. And then basically these little balls will appear. They'll fall off the tree. They'll really hard to begin with, but then even in the wintertime to the spring, they will start getting really soft. And then when you step on them, they puff out. So this is those puffs contain those fluffy winged seeds. So the idea is that these trees go off wind pollination or wind to pollinate those little seeds. All right. There's a lot of oaks in Nebraska, but I picked the largest one because of the acorn. So this is your Bur Oak tree. These are very large trees. They get up to about 100 feet long. They could get 100 feet wide as well with all the branches on them. They have very large leaves, sometimes up to 9 or 10 inches long, and they have that central midrib, or that big piece basically right there, that vein. And then the lobes, depending on the species of oaks, are going to be very different. If you notice on this one, there's little spaces between them. Some of them only have 3 lobes. If you look at things like your pin oaks or your red oaks, they're going to be very different. But all oak trees will produce acorns. It just depends on the type of oak, what type of acorn they produce. The bur oaks are the largest of all of the native acorns. And they have this little husk on them. They're very large, and you know it's a bur oak because they have that little fuzzy husk. So at the beginning of the year when the seed is forming, they will be very hard. And then towards the end of the year when the leaves, or when the acorns drop, it's really easy to peel off that husk. All right, I tried to pick something different here. This is a native shrub, kind of like a small tree, whatever you want to call it, but it's the sumac. So there's different types of sumac. This is the smooth sumac. The leaves are alternate. They have individual leaflets on them. They have a single, very thick stem on them. And then also when you break apart the leaves, it's almost like milkweed. They produce kind of a white sticky sap on them. And then as they turn a little bit later to the fall, they'll get that pretty reddish color. The seeds in them, or the fruits, they go in about August through September, and there's a certain sweet spot in there that if you can make actual lemonade with the fruits on them, certain time of year you can make lemonade and drink it. But those clusters are going to be really velvety, and when you break them open, they're fleshy, very similar to like a berry or like a choke cherry or something like that. All right, and then I think I have a couple more here, but this one again is one of my favorites. I picked up the leaf today. It's huge, like you can see my hand. Very, very cool, very distinctive leaf. So this is called your American sweet gum. So these leaves are very glossy. Sometimes they will have a little bit of a purple tinge to them, but they look like a star. Occasionally they have 7 little pieces. Most of them have 5. And then the fruit of them, the seed is super cool. It looks like this. I'll try to hold it up to the camera as much as I can. But this is what it looks like. Let's see if that's better. So this is the capsule, is what it's called. And inside the capsule, there are these small little winged seeds. So usually when they have wings on them, they rely on wind for pollination. And that helps with their seed dispersal. There's a little tiny substance in here on the seeds that helps it disperse as well. So this is your sweet gum. All right. And then your ash tree. So I had to give some love to ash trees. They've had a rough go at it. A long time ago when like Lincoln was starting to get developed, they put all the elm trees in, but then you had the Dutch elm disease. So they've replaced them with ash trees. And now we have the emerald ash borer. So now they're taking them all down so as the trees don't get infected, but poor ash trees, but they do have a wide variety of seeds. In them. So these guys were really popular. Like I said, they fast grow. They're very adaptable. A lot of residential areas still have ash trees. There's green ash, white ash is ish common, but green is going to be probably one of the most common ones you're going to see, but they have very distinctive leaves on them. They're usually pretty large, 6 to 9 inches long. And then they have 5 to 9, just depends on these, what's called lance shaped leaflets. And then immediately you'll notice that they're one of the first leaves to fall in the fall. They'll turn a bright yellow and they'll drop right away. But the seeds, these little they're called samaras, which are the seeds. They're very small, they're flat, they almost feel like styrofoam or cardboard, but those are the seeds. So they have the little wing that extends, they fall down, and then the idea is that they blow. So again, using wind as their pollinator. All right, last one, I believe. So I had to throw in something different for Western Nebraska people. And also we do have cactus, and a lot of people don't know that. So this is a true native cactus to the Western United States. It's a little bit more of a cold tolerant cactus. So that's why we see it in Nebraska. But they have very shallow roots that help capture rainfall. And then they have these super cool modified leaves. So basically the spines are leaves. They're just modified to protect the plant so that animals do not eat them, but they also produce a fruit. And I did not know what they were called. Apparently the fruit of the prickly pear cactus is called a tuna. So I just immediately think of The Office and Big Tuna, but these are the little fruits. They're called tunas. A lot of people use them in drinks and medicines, sometimes in dyes, but you can see them, the pretty flowers. It depends on how old the cactus is. If they're a little bit older, they're going to be a little bit more red. If they're a little bit younger of a plant, they'll be more yellow or kind of a pinky color. So you can tell age by looking at the cactus and the flowers, and then those flowers again will turn into those fruits. All right, I think that's it. So it's a little bit longer of one today, but there was a lot of good information, and there's so many tree species. I'm sorry if I didn't hit your favorite one. There's a lot to talk about. So we could do a whole season on leaves and seeds. So next week we're going to continue. There's no bye week or anything now. So next week is already November. Oh my gosh. So we're going to be talking about the science of insect antennas. So the different shapes of insect antennas, why they have different shapes, the functions of them and the different parts that they have. So everything from moths to the the harlequin beetles and stuff like that. So talking a lot about those. We have catfish, and then our last one that was supposed to be last week is actually going to be our last one in November. It's the science of water birds. So if you like what you saw, if you want to send this to someone to watch, or if they didn't make it today, we will send an email to everyone that was registered, and we will send them the recording, a Survey Monkey. If you fill it out and help us out, do an evaluation, we'll send you some swag. If you like information or kind of some fun facts or information about resources out there, we have our education Facebook page. We also have our education Instagram page, and then we have our main Nebraska Wildlife Education website as well. And then thank you. We will see all of you hopefully next week for insect antennas. So I will go ahead and stop sharing, and we will see if there's anything in the chat. So I'm always worried if there's nothing in the chat, because I feel like I either threw too much at you or it was confusing and you have no idea where to start with questions. But I'll take it as this was good and we don't have questions. So hopefully everyone learned some stuff. I learned some stuff while doing this as well. Like I said, I went pretty far from almost, failing botany to doing a program. I never thought I'd see myself, 12 years later doing a program on this. So this is great. All right. Well, we'll see everyone next week for insect antennas. So thanks, everyone. Tuna is a super funny name for a cactus fruit. I thought that was neat too. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We will see you next week. Thank you.